have Nadia Arginteanu joining us to discuss special needs trusts. She'll be helping us to understand what a special needs trust is and different types of trusts available, how to establish one, and many other important considerations to guide you when planning for the future of your loved one. This is one of a series of live stream presentations that are typically aired on the third Thursday of each month at noon. We'll keep it under 60 minutes. We will also use the chat box, so if you have questions, please feel free to chat us and we'll do our best to answer them. Today's guest, Nadia Arginteanu, is an attorney with a wealth of knowledge and experience on special needs trusts and means-tested government benefit programs that provide supports and services to persons with disabilities. Nadia is the in-house trust counsel at NYSARC Trust Services, a division of the ARC New York, where she supports all legal areas of trust administration. Nadia presents regularly on the topic of special needs trusts and benefit eligibility to families and professionals serving the disability community, including the New York State Bar Association and the Surrogates Association of New York. The ARC New York is a family-based, not-for-profit organization that has served people with intellectual and developmental disabilities since 1949. The ARC New York established NYSARC Trust Services in 1972 and has since expanded the mission of the ARC New York by offering special needs trust services to individuals of all ages and varying disabilities. NYSARC Trust Services administers primarily pooled special needs trusts as well as first and third party individual trusts, which we'll learn more about, helping thousands of people across New York State protect their eligibility for means-tested government benefits and improve their quality of life. Thank you so much for joining us, Nadia. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so what is a special needs trust and why would somebody set up a special needs trust?
So a special needs trust is a special type of trust that's allowable under state and federal regulations that allows someone with disabilities who receives means-tested government benefits, usually that means supplemental security income, that's SSI, and Medicaid. It allows that individual to shelter funds in a trust and use those funds to enhance their quality of life while maintaining their eligibility for those government benefits. So it really lets someone with disabilities have the best of both worlds. Once the money is in the trust, the money can be used to enhance that individual's quality of life by paying for things that their government benefits don't provide, and then enhance their quality of life beyond what their basic benefits provide. So the situation when an SNT can be useful is when you have someone with disabilities who receives those means-tested government benefits. They're only allowed to have a limited amount of money in their name and maintain their eligibility. So for someone who receives supplemental security income, they can only have $2,000 in their name without potentially impacting their government benefits. So an SNT is a really great tool to allow someone to have that excess funds to enhance their quality of life while maintaining their eligibility. An SNT can be used to shelter the individual's own funds, or it can be funded by a parent, a grandparent, another loved one to prepare for their financial future. And the reason why this is so important is that the alternative is either parents and loved ones can't give money to help enhance the quality of life of their loved one with disabilities, or if that individual comes into some of their own money, like an inheritance or a lawsuit settlement, they're basically forced to spend that money as quickly as possible in order to maintain their government benefit eligibility. So using an SNT allows them to shelter that money over a period of time so it can kind of enhance their quality of life over the years instead of having to be spent quickly and often frivolously in order to maintain their government benefit eligibility.
Got it. And what are some examples of things you can pay for with funds from a special needs trust or an SNT?
So the main rule about how money in SNT can be used is that the money has to be used for the primary benefit of a trust beneficiary, and it can only pay for things that the government benefits don't provide. So what that means is that if someone receives Medicaid, the trust money can't be used to pay for the type of medical services that they're receiving through Medicaid. Or if they receive supplemental security income, the money can't be used to pay for shelter and food without impacting their SSI benefit. However, beyond that, the money can be used for really so many things. There's a lot more the trust can pay for than what it can't pay for. A lot of times it's uncovered medical expenses, it can be assistive technologies, it can also be things that are really purely life enhancing. That can be recreation, it could be music classes, therapies that aren't covered by Medicaid, really anything that for the specific individual is going to enhance their quality of life. So it's very unique to each person. Oh,
that's great. And I think you were starting to get into, who can put in different types of funds. So what types of special needs trusts exist?
So there's a few different types of trusts, and really the biggest difference is where the money is coming from. So there's something called a third-party trust, and that means that it's someone else's money being put into the trust for the benefit of a disabled individual. So a lot of times that's a parent, a grandparent, another family member who wants to prepare for the financial future of their loved one with a disability. And they can use a third-party trust to shelter that money so it can be available to enhance their quality of life but not cause that negative impact on benefit eligibility. You can also have a first-party trust where it's the individual's own money. Oftentimes that's a retroactive disability payment, it's a settlement from a lawsuit, it could be a direct inheritance, but it's their own money that they need to shelter for their benefit eligibility. There's also two main types of trusts in terms of how the trust is structured. So there's an individual trust, and that would mean that you would go to an attorney, they would draft a trust document for you, you would pick your own trustee, and then that trust would shelter the money. There's also something called a pool trust. That's what NYSARC Trust Services primarily administers. A pool trust, you have a not-for-profit organization as trustee, and there's one trust document that we've already written that everyone who uses the pool trust can participate in. So with an individual trust, typically they're more expensive because you have to go to an attorney and pay them to administer them, but you're also given some freedom to put in terms of your own and pick your own trustee. So, and a lot of times that's a good choice. With a pool trust, they're typically less expensive and easier to enroll in. So it could be a good choice for someone who has a more modest amount of money to shelter. But you also have a professional trustee who really understands the benefit structure, understands how the money can and can't be used. So it can be a lot of benefit to a family just to have, another professional involved in their loved one's life who can serve as an additional advocate for their benefit.
And in terms of, Evan brought up a question about can an S&T cover legal costs as well, and maybe some of those legal costs of setting up that individual trust?
So an S&T can definitely cover legal expenses, again, if they're for the primary benefit of the individual who the trust is set up for. So a great example of that we often see is, if an individual needs a guardian, the trust can pay for guardianship expenses. But if there's a legal expense that's not for the primary benefit of that individual, the trust can really only pay for some, if any, of that expense. So it really depends on the situation.
Okay. And you kind of summarized some really great pros and cons for us between the individual and the pooled trust, so some of the administration fees and that type of thing, and then also started to get into the difference between the first and third party and where that money's coming from. And I think that kind of is also setting up that for us, kind of that stage of when's a good time for a family to set up an S&T?
I think that's a really great question. I know that dealing with these kind of financial issues can be really daunting for families. And I really want to empower families to realize that there really is no exact time to set up a trust. It's more about realizing when situations could arise where a trust might be needed and realizing that there is a trust solution for all of those different situations. One thing I definitely like to encourage families to do is to put a third-party trust in their will. That way, if money is left to their loved one when they pass away, there's not going to be any concern about impacting their benefit for eligibility. I encourage people to do that even when you have modest means, just because it really gives you that peace of mind of knowing that if something happened unexpectedly, you wouldn't be creating any sort of issue for your loved one after you're no longer there to help them. So I really encourage people to do that. As far as the first-party trust goes, identifying that situation is when you realize that someone has a sum of money that's going to impact their benefit eligibility moving forward. Sometimes it is that lump sum that needs to go somewhere, otherwise it's going to impact their benefits. Something else that we have been seeing more and more is individuals who are receiving a disabled adult child benefits, which means that they are getting Social Security benefits claiming on their parents' work record. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, you have someone who hasn't really ever had much income, all of a sudden having way more income than they had in the past. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, their needs are mostly met already through the services they receive. So for that individual, they can kind of be constantly coming up on that feeling of how much money they can have in the bank. So that's another situation where you might want to consider using that first-party SNT. And kind of like we already touched on, when you're wondering about using a pooled trust or an individual trust, that's really looking at the situation, whether you have someone to serve as trustee, how much money you're looking to shelter, about which of those would be the right option. Mm-hmm. Something else we always like to share with people is that for someone over 65 years old, which, you know, the people that we're working with now, the families that we're talking to, we're talking to people who are much younger than that. But for someone over 65, they can only use a pooled trust. Okay. So that's nice to know that down the road, you know, years and years from now, there is still an SNT option that they could access to protect funds and maintain eligibility for benefits.
Great. And so how would a family go about establishing an SNT?
So in this situation, we encourage a lot of people to consult with an attorney if they really don't know where to begin. Especially if you're trying to set up an individual trust or put a trust in your will, you really need to go to an attorney to do that. In preparation for this presentation, we did put together a tip sheet that we hope could help prepare you for that kind of first meeting with an attorney or another professional. Just some notes of things to bring with you, questions that you might want to have, because we really want to encourage people that if you're going through the process of meeting with an attorney, make the most of that opportunity. Come prepared, come with questions, so when you're there, you can really handle all of that. When it comes to setting up a pooled trust, you can contact a pooled trust organization directly. You know, our intake department here at NYSARC Trust Services, for example, speaks with families all the time, walking them through the intake process and explaining to them which of our trust programs might be the right fit. One of the other things that makes a pooled trust so accessible to so many people is that you don't need an attorney to do it. We always encourage people to get legal advice based on their comfort level, but you don't need an attorney to enroll in a pooled trust, which is part of what makes it so accessible to so many people.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and for everyone listening in, we'll be emailing out PowerPoint and that tip sheet that Nadia mentioned. Mm-hmm. It's really great. It has some questions you can go in. So when you do call NYSARC or maybe a private attorney or kind of start to do your own research, it gives you some basic questions to ask and some things to think about, which I think is really useful tool going into those meetings because you have a little more idea of what questions to ask while you're doing that. So speaking of those questions, what are some examples, Nadia, of questions that like families should ask when they kind of call in? What might be something they consider as in addition to just the different types that are out there?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important considerations are about who your loved one is. You know, what are their abilities? What things do they need help with? What's their living situation now? Where do you think they may be living in the future? You know, think about your loved one as they are now and how you want their life to look like, and make sure you bring those things up with the attorney, with the professional that you're talking to. You know, let the attorney know, this is the money that we have to shelter, and this is how I want it to be used. So you can learn how the money can be used in the trust to enhance your loved one's quality of life based on exactly who they are. I also encourage people to keep in mind that when you're having this chance to talk to an attorney, if you have any questions about guardianship, about healthcare proxies, things like that, it's a good opportunity to talk about those issues as well. You can really take this opportunity to really do a lot of planning for the future of your loved one, not just the SNT.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. And speaking of kind of guardians and people who remain involved in a young person's life as they move into adulthood and kind of become a legal adult, so reach the age of majority at 18 in a lot of states. What's the role of a trustee? Kind of who takes over a trust and helps figure out how to spend the money and fills out the paperwork? who is that and kind of what are their responsibilities?
Right. So, in this presentation, I'm going to try and not use a lot of legal terms, but when we're talking about trustees, I think it's important to know that they are a fiduciary, which is a legal term, and that means that whoever you choose to be a trustee has the legal responsibility to make sure the trust is administered appropriately, and that's a big responsibility. So when we're talking to people who are choosing who might be the trustee, a lot of times people look to family members and loved ones, but we want to encourage people to have a frank conversation about, what that means to be a trustee, what the responsibilities are, because the responsibilities are, you have to be knowledgeable and trustworthy and responsible, because it is the responsibility of the trustee to learn the regulations about how a trust can and can't be used, to report to state agencies on an annual basis as necessary. It can be really complicated. So that's why, a lot of times people will choose a loved one, a brother or sister who, of course, wants to step up and be trustee, but then down the road when the time comes for them to actually serve, they have a job, they have a family of their own, and they're realizing that maybe it's too much. So we really encourage people to have a frank conversation about what being a trustee means, because it's a lot of responsibility. If someone can't find, they don't have a friend or loved one to serve as trustee, you can find a professional to serve as trustee. And for some people, that's a great option. Professional trustees will have experience with government benefits, with trust administration, so they know all the ins and outs of that. Something else that we also like to bring up is that sometimes as trustee, you have to say no. You have to say no, even though that sounds great, the money in the trust can't be spent that way. And for some families, it's kind of nice to have the person saying no be a third party. So it doesn't, that part of being a trustee doesn't come into the family relationship. There's someone else who has that role of saying yes and saying no, and the family can kind of keep that out of the family dynamic.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And would you have to be a guardian to be a trustee? How are those two concepts connected?
So you don't have to be a guardian to be a trustee. Definitely with a lot of people, we serve for the pool trust. We serve as trustee, but the guardian is the person that we work very closely with to identify what the money in the trust can be used for the benefit of the individual. Something else when we talk about guardianship that I like to bring up is that when you're establishing a trust, so that means you're signing our joinder agreement to join the pool trust, you're working with an attorney. If there's a guardian in place, the guardian has the legal authority to sign those documents and kind of create the trust. That is a question we get a lot as well.
Oh, great. Evan has another really good question, which is, could the beneficiary themselves, so the individual who has a disability, be appointed as the trustee until later, or maybe a family member who's establishing the trust, could they also appoint themselves and then have successors? How does that all kind of work?
So with the special needs trust, the trust beneficiary can't be their own trustee, but family members definitely can appoint themselves as trustee of the trust and then pick successors moving forward. Right. I would definitely encourage a family who's creating their own third-party trust to think forward and pick successors, because I definitely work with legal professionals who are in a situation where there's no successor trustee and they're trying to find someone to fill that role. So definitely that's a great idea to figure out, who could be a successor trustee. Similar to, when you become a guardian and you might have a successor guardian. So if you're no longer able to serve, you have that backup. And that's just another way of using these tools to create peace of mind and know that the future is planned for.
Oh, great. And what happens if you can't identify somebody to be a trustee?
So if you can't identify someone to be a trustee, that's where I would really encourage someone to consider looking for a professional trustee. So that can be an attorney. There are people who will just work as professional trustees who are trust officers. Sometimes banks will serve as professional trustee. Okay. Anecdotally, I've been told that they really only do that for quite large sums of money. But the other option would be a pool trust. That's, I think, a really great tool for a family who can't identify someone to serve as trustee. There's a variety of different programs, including ours, that are pooled trust, and we provide that professional administration. for families who otherwise wouldn't have someone to serve that role.
Oh, great. And you had mentioned earlier about kind of the funds from an S&T are intended to supplement but not necessarily replace services that a beneficiary can otherwise get through some of these maybe government or public funded programs, such as food and shelter that they can get through maybe their SSI benefit. How does this work in places that have particularly high rent or living costs, such as New York City or other parts of New York State?
So the touchstone for how funds in a trust can be used really is that they're supposed to go above and beyond someone's government benefits. They're supposed to enhance their quality of life, because the hope is that the services and benefits that someone's receiving through the state are going to cover those basic needs. And when we're talking about kind of the cost of living, usually that's someone who receives SSI, Supplemental Security Income, which is supposed to cover food and shelter expenses. And now it is possible for the trust to contribute towards food and shelter expenses, which would cause a reduction in their SSI benefit. And for some people, it's a cost-benefit analysis. And for some people who might have a lot of money in a trust and who would really benefit from a nicer apartment in a better neighborhood, something like that, for them, it might be worth the risk of that reduction in benefits to help supplement their living expenses. For other people, you do that cost-benefit analysis and you realize maybe that's not the best way to use the funds to enhance this individual quality of life. And I think that this is a really good example of why having a good trustee is important. Because you want a trustee who's able to do that cost-benefit analysis and who's able to say, you know what, no, that isn't the right thing. Or, yes, I'm willing to take this risk and it's an educated decision. Because that could really impact someone's future when it comes to their benefit eligibility, when it comes to how long the money in the trust is going to be around. But it's certainly an option, for certain people depending on their living situation.
And since we're on the topic of kind of how the trusts are set up and how that affects supplemental security income, a Social Security, SSI, a Social Security benefit, Catherine was asking, would there be any need or advantage for young children, so individuals under 18, to set up an S&T? Does that affect kind of that child's ability potentially to receive SSI if they have that set up? And how does that work for people younger than 18?
Right. So I think the answer to that question really depends on their individual living situation and whether that child's own resources are being taken into account for their benefit eligibility. So what I would tell anyone is that if an individual's resources aren't being looked at for their benefit eligibility, they wouldn't need a special needs trust. So in the case of a child, they wouldn't need a trust yet. But it's something to consider in the future. And certainly when you're talking about whether, that family wants to set aside funds for the future of their child when their child's over 18, in that situation, I would encourage the family to consider creating a third-party trust, even though the child's under 18, knowing that that's going to be a vehicle that will be around for the rest of their life. And I think the part of the reason why that's beneficial is that you don't want to create a situation where the child turns 18 and all of a sudden there's a big stress and rush to deal with all this money so they can become eligible for benefits based on their own resources. This is kind of where the future planning and looking at these tools can help, create peace of mind and reduce stress in the future.
Right. So thinking, when they are younger, before they hit that 18, is really important. That's a key part. And also, I think you were kind of mentioning, the child's income or resources that are in the child's name when they're under 18. That might be a place to consider a trust as well, right? When they might get, like you said previously, maybe a lump sum through some back pay or like a legal case or anything like that. If the child is going to be receiving something in their name, that might be a good time to consider setting up. That's a
great example. We encourage people to look at not only what the money that someone has now, but what they might be entitled to in the future. A great example of that is a legal settlement. Sometimes, if there's a medical malpractice issue when a child is a child, they could be entitled to a lump sum when they turn 18.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice to kind of think to the future and realize we might not need the SNT now, but when they turn 18, we're going to need this trust because they're coming into this lump sum, and these are our options, you know, down the road when we do need it.
Great. So for each of these different types of trusts, what happens to leftover funds of an individual, the beneficiary of the trust, once they pass away, if there's any leftover funds in their trust?
So what happens to funds after a beneficiary passes away, it depends on whether the trust was funded with the individual's own money or the money of a third party, and whether it's an individual trust or a pooled trust.
Mm-hmm.
So with a third-party trust, that means, you know, you're putting money in the trust for the benefit of your loved one. In your trust document, you're able to designate who you would like to get that money after the beneficiary passes away. Okay. So that gives you control of those remainder beneficiaries.
Mm-hmm.
With a third-party trust, you know, when it's an individual's own money, there is required Medicaid payback when the beneficiary passes away. So that means that before any remainder beneficiaries, third parties can receive any money, any states that provide Medicaid services have to have their services repaid.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to a pooled trust, they're a little bit different based on the federal regulation that permits our programs to exist. And typically, pooled trusts actually retain the funds and use that money to support other individuals with disabilities. You know, an example of NYSARC Trust Services. When our beneficiaries in the pooled trust programs pass away, we use the money to support unfunded corporate guardianship programs and to provide recreation activities for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities that are served by ARC New York chapters across the state.
Mm-hmm.
Other trust programs might use that money a little bit differently, but if the trust doesn't retain the money, they're also going to have to repay Medicaid before any remainder beneficiaries can get the funds.
Great. And that's amazing too, to hear that, you know, for a nonprofit, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of going back to enhance other individuals' lives who maybe have a similar disability. So that's nice to hear as well. One of our listeners was kind of asking about tax considerations as well in establishing a trust or in taking funds out. What should parents be aware of, or caregivers, or those who are establishing a trust? What should they be aware of as they kind of look to establish these trusts when it comes to taxes?
So the tax implications are really going to vary, you know, from family to family based on how much money you're putting in the trust. So I would really encourage people to consult with an accountant, you know, with a tax professional on that. Because without knowing more information about someone's individual situation, I can't really give the right answer. Generally speaking, once the money is in the trust, it can be used without tax implications. If someone's money is in a trust and there are capital gains or income over the year, there could be some tax liabilities for the trust. That's a good example of one of the other responsibilities of a trustee. Trustees are responsible for handling the tax filings of the trust itself. So using a professional trustee or a pooled trust like NYSARC, we handle all that tax reporting, which would otherwise be the responsibility of the trustee.
Gotcha. And then that also brings up we're talking about, we're going to use the funds to do this and use the funds to do this. How do people take funds out? How does that work?
Right. So that's really going to depend on whether you have an individual trust or whether you're using a pooled trust. Different pooled trusts have a different process for how to access the funds, and different individual trustees might administer things differently. One of the things that I definitely could stress in any of those situations is that an SNT is never going to be able to give just money to the individual, because if you think about it, you spent all this time and effort creating this trust that's going to shelter this money so that someone can maintain their eligibility for government benefits. And if you just start distributing cash to them, it's really undoing that protection. So generally speaking, the way money in SNTs is used is that it's used to reimburse or pay third parties. So a great example that we see all the time is, you know, we can pay someone's cable bill. If they're not receiving SSI, we can pay their rent. We can pay utilities. You know, we can pay those kind of third-party vendors directly. You can also use the money to reimburse people who have bought things for their loved one. You know, a lot of times we work with parents, you know, siblings, other loved ones of a disabled individual, and they will use their own credit card to go buy clothing or recreation or take them on a trip, and we can reimburse that individual for the money that they spent. So, like, again, it really does depend on the trust program, how the individual trustee wants to handle things, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not usually going to be just a cash distribution. And part of the reason why that is that, at least from the perspective of our trust program, is that we want to make sure that when we're distributing money from the trust that it's being used correctly, because we don't want to impact someone's benefit eligibility. So when we're paying someone's cable bill, we request a copy of that cable bill, and then we keep those records. So in the future, if any government agency wants to know how the money in the trust has been used, we can go through our records and pull together that information. So again, that's another example of something that the trustee has a responsibility to do when you're having that conversation. If you want a loved one to be a trustee, you let them know that there's going to be a lot of record keeping involved.
Got it. And also, just to kind of clarify the two ways, is you can pay directly those third-party vendors. So, you know, pay the landlord directly or pay the cable company directly, or maybe a caregiver, family member, whoever might pay for something and then reimbursed. So it sounds like there's kind of
so we're paying like third-party vendors directly and then third-party individuals directly. Basically anyone who's not that trust beneficiary.
Got it. Great. And then kind of speaking a little bit more, you'd mentioned it at the beginning, but also just sort of clarifying what are those income, or rather resource limits when it comes to public benefits like Medicaid and SI? What's the maximum amount that an individual can have? Because I know Catherine had asked about that again. What's the maximum amount an individual can have to continue to receive those other government benefits?
So for the group here today, I think most of the individuals that we're talking about are going to be receiving supplemental security income, and then by virtue of their SSI eligibility, receiving Medicaid. And for someone who receives SSI, they can only have $2,000 in their name before it could potentially impact their benefit eligibility. For someone who doesn't receive SSI and is purely looking for Medicaid eligibility, they're able to have a little bit over $14,000 in the bank, and they're able to have $862 a month in income. So the limits are a little higher, but I think for the people that we're talking to today, you're mostly looking at that $2,000 SSI resource limit.
Yeah, definitely. Another great question that came up in our comments was, for special needs trusts, is the money put in those trusts, is it invested in any way? Does it have an interest rate return? Does that look different depending on what type of trust you're getting?
Right. So that's definitely going to look different depending on what trust program you're using. If you set up an individual trust, you have some more control over that, about how you want the money invested. From our perspective, we find that depending on how much money someone has, you might not want to heavily invest it because you wouldn't have as much tolerance for losses. You want that money to be available. One of the great things about a pooled trust is the reason why they're called pooled trusts is that everyone who's using that trust, all their money is pooled together for investment purposes, which means that my $10,000 is pooled with your $10,000 and everyone else's. So even though I only have a more modest amount of money, I get the investment power of a much larger pool of money. So that can give more opportunity for growth. It also can afford someone a more favorable rates from the bank. But in terms of investment, that's really going to depend on what program you're using and what kind of investment approach you're interested in taking.
And another great thing to add to that list of questions that you go in with when you're talking to a lawyer and an accountant and kind of trying to think through what makes the most sense for my loved one in establishing one of these SNTs. So how does the family enroll in a pooled trust at NYSARC specifically?
So for us specifically, I would encourage anyone who's interested in our program to first look on our website. There's a wealth of information there. And then really just to give us a call. We have a wonderful customer service team and a wonderful intake team that are really here to just talk to everyone all day long, answering their questions, and walking them through the process. In terms of how enrollment in a pooled trust works, and this is for our program and any program, it's going to require filling out a vendor agreement, which is really just demographic information about your loved one, who they are, where they live, what type of money they're sheltering. We collect that information along with information about what benefits they're receiving, and we use that information to open their file and open the bank account for them. So that's really our process. And I think I said this earlier, but you don't need an attorney to open a pooled trust with us. But I always like to encourage people to consult with an attorney if that's what they feel most comfortable doing and they have the means to do so. I don't want anyone to ever feel like we're encouraging them not to do that, because, you know, an attorney in this situation can be another great advocate for the family to help answer questions and to help walk them through this process of joining the pooled trust, but also answer any other questions they may have about benefits, about guardianship, about, you know, a whole constellation of things.
Definitely. And are there different types of pooled trusts available through NYSARC, and what would kind of be the differences between them?
Yes, so we have 3 different pooled trust programs, and they're all first-party pooled trusts, so that's when the individual needs to shelter their own money. We have Community Trust 1 and Community Trust 3, which are designed for an individual who has a lump sum of money to shelter. The real difference there is that Community Trust 3 is for someone who has over $250,000 to shelter. And our Community Trust 2, that's designed for someone who has too much monthly income for Medicaid eligibility. And that program is actually primarily used by seniors with disabling chronic conditions who need to receive home and community-based services through Medicaid to get long-term care. So that's a very unique program. It's actually a program unique to New York, and that's one of our larger pooled trust programs. We do also have a third-party trust program called the Unrestricted Fund. And for that program, I would need to work directly with your family's attorney, and I could provide them the information and walk you through enrolling in that program as well.
Oh, great. And so we can call you, head to NYSARC's website, kind of get a few more details too about all of these different types of trusts, correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. So another thing that often comes up in my conversations with families are ABLE accounts. This whole new thing. So what are ABLE accounts and how are they different from an SNT?
Right. Yeah, ABLE accounts they're relatively new, and we get this question a lot. So ABLE accounts, they're modeled after 529 college saving accounts. ABLE accounts are 529A accounts. And they're a tax-advantaged savings account that allows someone to, again, set aside money for the benefit of someone with a disability without impacting their government benefits. One of the great things about an ABLE account is it does help promote independence for the individual because it acts more like a traditional bank account than any form of a special needs trust does. So it can be a really great tool for someone who is capable of managing their own finances. It can give them a little bit more independence in that way. We also like to caution people about ABLE accounts just that because of that independence, there's also the possibility for mismanagement. So we want to make sure that when people are going that route, that they know that there is kind of, again, responsibility on the individual, similar to how an SNT, there's responsibility on the trustee to make sure the money is properly used. There are ABLE accounts across the country. New York has our own ABLE account. You can go to mynYable.org, and that gives you some more information about the program. It gives you a copy of the application, which you can also just do online. And that can kind of walk someone through how to actually enroll in the program.
Great. And I realized I should clarify for everybody listening, ABLE is A-B-L-E, ABLE account. So if you're Googling or trying to find the website that Nadia just gave to check out New York's ABLE account, you can also Google New York ABLE, and that'll be the first thing that pops up.
If you Google New York ABLE, it'll come up. ABLE is an acronym for Achieving a Better Life Experience. That was the name of the act that created ABLE accounts nationwide.
Awesome. And Catherine actually brings up exactly what was going to be, the next question, because you had talked about this being a 529 account. So can you set up both a 529 and a 529A account in this way, with the 529A being the ABLE account? And also, can you roll a 529 account into an SNT or an ABLE account?
So you can roll a 529 account into an ABLE account until December 31st, 2025. I think that's, for whatever reason, that's the cap that state has put on the ability to do that. And there's just a form that you have to do. So you could set up both. However, if you're not rolling over the 529 account into the 529A account, if the beneficiary is disabled, there's no penalty for withdrawing the funds if you need to do something else with them in the future, but you would have to pay taxes on any of the income. So I would just encourage a family to consider, if you're going to fund both, do you need to fund both? How are you intending on using that money? I think kind of the same way, the same considerations that you think of when you're going into that first meeting to talk to someone about an SNT. It's similar considerations. It's what's your child's abilities? What do you want their future to look like? How could this money benefit them? I think something that's really important to note about ABLE accounts is that you can only fund them with $15,000 a year from any source.
Gotcha.
So if you're looking at funding a 529 and a 529A, if you already have $15,000 in the ABLE account and all of a sudden you want to roll over the college savings account, you might have to wait a year to do that because of the limit of contribution. So there's a lot of factors to consider. But certainly, just like you can have an ABLE account and an SNT, I don't see any reason why you couldn't have an ABLE account and a college savings account if that's what's going to best serve your family.
Yeah, and a lot of the families we work with, might have established this 529, that college savings account, when their child was very young, and then over time began to realize maybe college isn't the path because of the disability or whatever it might be, and kind of, I think, consulting with an accountant and figuring out the way in which you can roll that over and what penalties might exist and how to do that is probably the best approach for any family, it sounds like, who's looking at that. We did have an earlier question that I want to kind of bring up as well. So what happens if the beneficiary, the individual with the disability who has this S&T, special needs trust, what happens when they end up in a nursing home? Can that S&T still exist? How does it get used? And what factors might be involved with that?
So when someone goes into a nursing home and they're still receiving Medicaid, what I'd like to point out to people is that that's institutional Medicaid. That's nursing home Medicaid. So when you hear people talking about transfers of assets and the 5-year penalty period and the look-back period, that's for a nursing home. If someone has funded a pooled trust before going into a nursing home, that penalty period would only apply to any funds that are left in the trust. So let's say, I had put $50,000 in a pooled trust, and now I have to go in a nursing home, and there's $20,000 left. Only that $20,000 would create a penalty problem for my nursing home Medicaid. But the money that's in the trust, that's still available for the individual to use for their benefit. So we have a lot of individuals in that Community Trust 2 program I mentioned, where we have elderly New Yorkers with disabling chronic conditions. They often, eventually have to go into a nursing home to get the level of care they need. So we can use the money in their trust to enhance their stay in the nursing home, buy some things that are above and beyond what the nursing home would provide to make their stay there more comfortable. Once someone's in a nursing home and they're receiving Medicaid, they're no longer going to be able to shelter funds in an SNT, whether it's income or resources, but any funds in an existing SNT can be used. Something else that I would like to mention, again, this isn't quite as applicable to our population that we're talking about today who are receiving Medicaid by virtue of their SSI eligibility, but for someone who needs community Medicaid, so they're not going to a nursing home. They're going to receive Medicaid in the community. There is no 5-year look-back period. So technically, I could transfer all of my assets this month, and in May, be eligible for community Medicaid. And I could put all my funds in an SNT this month, and next month have eligibility for community Medicaid.
Oh, great. Okay, good to know. And then Catherine's asking about any limits on the ABLE account, but also just in general, are there any limits to how much you can have in any of these types of SNTs, including maybe an ABLE account or pooled versus individual, all of it?
Right. So for an SNT, there is no limit on how much money you can contribute in a given year or how much money you can have in an account over time or how many SNTs you can have. You can have multiple SNTs. Okay. For ABLE accounts, it's only one account per person, and you can only put in $15,000 per year from any source. So that's the individual's own money and money from third parties. With an ABLE account, up to the first $100,000 in the account won't impact their eligibility for SSI benefits. Anything over that could impact their eligibility for SSI benefits. And there's a cap in the total amount that could be in an ABLE account of $300,000. But something to keep in mind in ABLE accounts is this program is very new, and you can only put in, it used to be $14,000 a year, now it's $15,000 a year. Okay. So we are many years away from really anyone who's participating in this program coming up against either of those, capped amounts.
Okay, great.
But they are there kind of in the future.
Okay, gotcha. So this whole time, we've sort of been talking about a lot of these are individual decisions. You kind of got to figure out what's best for you and best for your loved one. Speak to a lawyer, speak to an accountant, speak to a financial planner. What advice do you have to listeners about how to go about finding those experts to speak to? Not just like the questions do they ask along the way to those individuals, but how do they go about finding kind of those people to speak to as they make these decisions?
I think the best place to start is really in the networks that you already have. So whether it's people at the school that your child is going to, maybe they're already receiving services through an organization like the ARC New York, really reaching out to those networks and seeing what recommendations they may have. I know in terms of the legal community, because that's the community that I'm a part of, that a great resource is the New York State Bar Association. There's the Elder Law and Special Needs section, which is really a group of wonderful professionals in that elder law and special needs community that specialize in this type of work. I really encourage people that when you're looking for an attorney or a trustee or someone to work on with you about benefit eligibility, to find someone who that's their bread and butter. That's what they do, because this work is so nuanced. The rules really change, year after year, and you want someone who's paying attention to changes, who's going to know the most current way the law is looking, who's going to be able to best serve your family. So I would reach out to your networks. I would reach out to organizations like yours that can help point people in the right direction, and then turn to professional organizations like the New York State Bar Association that bring together really capable individuals who are eminent in their field.
I think that's great advice. We did have another question come up from Sarah, which is there a Medicaid payback for ABLE accounts?
That's a great question. So with an ABLE account, there is Medicaid payback, even if the money in the ABLE account is third-party money. So that's the big difference between an ABLE account and a trust, is that with a third-party SNT, there isn't that required Medicaid payback. That's a good example of where you'd want to weigh the pros and cons of which of these solutions is best for your family. One of the resources that you're going to receive from us after the presentation is a handout with some information about ABLE accounts and some information that's going to kind of compare and contrast special needs trust and ABLE accounts. And I really encourage people, when you're looking at that information and considering which solution is best for your family, to not think of it as one or the other. I think there's a lot of families where an ABLE account and an SNT could actually work really well in conjunction with each other to give the family the best of both worlds and really maximize the benefit they're able to get from their funds to enhance their loved one's quality of life.
That's great. And it sounds like with the combination of different accounts at different times, there's really a lot of options out there for families to really utilize all of these tools towards the benefit of their loved one. I think that's great. I think it seems like we're kind of wrapping up on questions from the audience, and so I want to thank you so much, Nadia, for joining us today and for all of your insights and expertise. I think it's been really amazing for all of us to hear from your wealth of knowledge and expertise in all of this. So we really appreciate that. As Nadia mentioned, and as I mentioned, the PowerPoint slides and more information on this topic, all of those handouts that Nadia was referencing, including NYSARC's contact information too, is going to be distributed via email, and it'll also be found on our website, www.includenyc.org, so you guys will all be able to find it there. Past live stream videos that we've done in previous months, and also today's live stream can be found on INCLUDEnyc's YouTube channel, which is accessible via our website as well. Our next live stream is going to be on Thursday, May 16th at 12 p.m. noon, and we're going to be discussing speech and language development in young children. So it should be a really exciting topic, but thinking about kind of a different end of the spectrum than we might be today. You can also check out our website for more information about other upcoming events and workshops. We hope to see you all at our next Include Live, real conversations on parenting and disability. Thanks. Bye.